History is full of dramatic disappearances, cities swallowed by jungles, armies erased in deserts, ships vanishing into storms. But one of the most famous disappearances in human history is strange for a different reason. No one actually saw it happen. There are no eyewitness accounts of panic, no chronicles describing a final march into oblivion, no graves marking the end. And yet, for nearly 3,000 years, people have been convinced that it did happen. 10 entire tribes of ancient Israel, according to tradition, simply vanished. Not in fire, not in plague, but on paper. The irony is hard to miss. The lost Jewish tribes are among the most discussed missing peoples in history, and yet the moment they supposedly disappeared passes almost unnoticed in the historical record. No dramatic finale, no clear ending, just silence. And as history has shown again and again, silence is where myths thrive. The story usually begins in the 8th century BCE, when the Assyrian Empire, one of the most efficient war machines of the ancient world, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Biblical texts tell us the population was deported, scattered among distant lands, and from that point forward, the 10 tribes fade from view. Later generations would call them lost, but that word carries an assumption. Lost implies wandering, survival, mystery. It implies that somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the known world, these tribes continue to exist, waiting to be rediscovered. But here's the problem. The Assyrians were meticulous record keepers. They catalogued their victories, listed deported populations, and carved their achievements into stone. And yet, they never described a great mystery, a vanishing people, or an unresolved disappearance. From their perspective, nothing unusual happened at all. A kingdom fell. Its people were relocated. Life went on. So, where does the mystery come from? This is where the tension begins. Were the lost tribes destroyed, their identities slowly erased through conquest and assimilation? Were they absorbed into surrounding populations, becoming invisible not because they vanished, but because history stopped paying attention to them? Or were they something else entirely? A story reshaped and reinvented long after the fact, molded to serve religious hope, political ambition, and colonial fantasy. Because the idea of the lost tribes didn't remain a footnote, it became an obsession. Medieval travelers claimed to find them beyond rivers of fire. Christian theologians placed them at the center of apocalyptic prophecy. European explorers identified them everywhere they landed. From Central Asia to Africa, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands, countless communities were declared descendants of ancient Israel, often without being asked. And that's what makes this story more than an ancient puzzle. The lost tribes became a mirror. People didn't just search for them, they projected onto them. Hope, fear, chosenness, justification. When history failed to provide clear answers, imagination stepped in to fill the gaps. This investigation is not about proving that the lost tribes survived in some hidden valley or distant continent. It's about understanding how historical silence transforms into certainty, how a lack of records becomes an invitation, and how myths, once born, can shape real-world decisions, colonization, conversion, and even modern identity politics. Because when records go silent, stories don't stop, they multiply. Over the course of this documentary, we're going to trace this mystery backward and forward in time. We'll start with what actually happened in the ancient Near East, what the evidence suggests, and what it doesn't. We'll examine how Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions interpreted the disappearance differently, and we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that many discoveries of the lost tribes tell us far more about the discoverers than the discovered. By the end, the question may no longer be where the lost tribes went, but why so many people needed them to be somewhere at all. To understand how the lost tribes could later be imagined as wandering nations or hidden peoples, we first have to step back into the world that created them, a world very different from how modern audiences usually picture ancient Israel. This was not a unified kingdom defined by bloodlines stretching neatly back to a single ancestor. It was a fragile Iron Age society shaped by geography, survival, and administration, where identity was as much practical as it was symbolic. In the early first millennium BCE, the land between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan Valley was a crossroads of empires. Egypt loomed to the south, Mesopotamian powers to the east, and trade routes cut through the hills and valleys. The people who would later be known as Israelites lived mostly in small agrarian settlements, villages clustered around terraced hillsides, dependent on rainfall, livestock, and seasonal harvests. Political unity was rare, and security was fragile. Out of this environment emerged two related but distinct kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel was wealthier, more populous, and more exposed to international trade and foreign influence. Judah was smaller, more centralized around Jerusalem, and more insulated, both geographically and culturally. This division matters because the idea of the 12 tribes did not function the same way in both regions, nor did it mean what later readers often assume it did. The word tribe today suggests ancestry, a large extended family bound by shared blood. But in the Iron Age Near East, tribal identity worked very differently. Tribes were administrative units. They organized land ownership, military obligations, taxation, and religious duties. They explained who owed service to whom, who worshipped where, and who could claim access to certain resources. Genealogy mattered, but it was flexible, political, and often retroactively constructed. Biblical genealogies, for example, were not birth certificates. They were tools. They created coherence in a fragmented society and linked local groups to a shared narrative. When a clan was absorbed, relocated, or reorganized, its lineage could be rewritten to fit a larger framework. This wasn't deception, it was how ancient societies made sense of change. The 12 tribes themselves appear less like a census and more like an idealized model. 12 was a symbolic number across the ancient Near East, associated with order and completeness. Months, constellations, and administrative divisions often followed this pattern. The tribal system provided balance. No single group was supposed to dominate completely, at least in theory. Reality, of course, was messier. Archaeology reinforces this picture. Excavations in the highlands show gradual settlement patterns, not a sudden arrival of a new people. Pottery styles, architecture, and diet suggest continuity with earlier Canaanite populations. In other words, ancient Israel was not born fully formed. It evolved. And as it evolved, identities shifted with it. Religion followed a similar path. Early Israelite worship was not strictly monotheistic in practice. Local shrines existed alongside centralized cult sites. Different regions emphasized different traditions. Tribal affiliation often determined where and how one worshipped, not just what one believed. Over time, especially in Judah, religious centralization would become a political tool, but that came later. So when ancient texts speak of tribes being exiled or lost, they are not describing neat, uniform populations being lifted whole and deposited elsewhere. They are describing administrative structures collapsing under imperial pressure. When Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, it didn't target bloodlines. It dismantled governance. Local elites were deported. Economic systems were disrupted. Communities were resettled and reorganized. What disappeared then was not necessarily a people, but a system. This distinction is crucial, because once you understand that tribes functioned more like regional identities than genetic ones, the mystery begins to look different. If a tribe's land was reassigned, its leadership removed, and its population mixed with others, did that tribe vanish, or did it simply stop being counted as a tribe? Later generations, especially those writing from Judah after Israel's fall, looked back at this collapse through the lens of loss. What had once been administrative divisions hardened into ancestral myths. What had been flexible identities became fixed categories, and from that shift, the idea of disappearance was born. The world that created the 12 tribes was not one obsessed with purity or permanence. It was pragmatic, adaptive, and constantly reshaping itself under pressure. Understanding that world doesn't solve the mystery of the lost tribes, but it tells us why the mystery exists at all, because you can't lose what was never static to begin with. By the late 8th century BCE, the world of the ancient Near East was no longer shaped by small kingdoms struggling for survival. It was dominated by empires, and none was more feared, more organized, or more brutally efficient than Assyria. From its heartland in Mesopotamia, the Assyrian state expanded outward with a singular goal: control, not just over land, but over people, resources, and trade routes. And when the northern kingdom of Israel found itself in Assyria's path, it was not singled out for special punishment, it was processed. The political situation leading up to 722 BC was already unstable. Israel sat between rival powers and had spent decades shifting alliances in an attempt to preserve autonomy. Kings rose and fell quickly, tribute was paid, withheld, and renegotiated. Rebellions flared, often encouraged by the distant hope of Egyptian support. But Assyria had little patience for unpredictability. When Israel's leadership attempted to break free from Assyrian dominance, the response was methodical. The campaign unfolded in stages. Assyrian forces advanced into the region, capturing fortified cities one by one. Archaeological layers showed destruction in key urban centers, burned structures, collapsed walls, and sudden abandonment. The capital, Samaria, held out for several years, but eventually fell. When it did, Assyria did not erase the land from the map. Instead, it reorganized it. This is where later myths often diverge from historical reality. The Assyrians did not practice genocide as a policy. Their power depended on productivity. Empty land produced nothing. Their solution was deportation, not annihilation. Populations deemed politically unreliable were relocated across the empire, while new groups were imported to replace them. The goal was to break local power structures and prevent rebellion, not to eliminate ethnic identity entirely. Contemporary Assyrian records are strikingly clear on this point. Royal inscriptions boast of numbers deported, cities subdued, and territories reorganized. They list captives as assets, workers, craftsmen, farmers, absorbed into the imperial economy. Nowhere do they describe a people disappearing into mystery. From the Assyrian perspective, Israel was not lost. It was redistributed. This policy had profound consequences on the ground. Local elites, the administrators, priests, and military leaders who maintained the tribal and regional systems, were removed. Without them, the structures that defined Israelite identity collapsed. What remained were rural populations, some of whom stayed, some of whom left, and some of whom were absorbed into newly mixed communities. Over time, distinctions blurred. The biblical account, written later and largely from a Judean perspective, frames this moment as catastrophe and punishment. It emphasizes exile, sin, and divine judgment. But it also reflects distance, both geographical and political. Judah survived Assyria for another century, and in that survival it became the primary narrator of Israel's past. The fall of the northern kingdom was remembered not as administrative reorganization, but as disappearance. And yet, even within the biblical text, hints of continuity remain. References appear to Israelites still living in the land, to intermarriage, to shared religious practices that persisted despite imperial control. These details don't fit neatly into the idea of total loss, but they align closely with what Assyrian records describe. What happened in 722 BCE, then, was not a vanishing act. It was a dismantling. A kingdom was removed from the political board, its population scattered across an empire that stretched from modern-day Iran to the Mediterranean coast. Over generations, these people adapted. Languages changed, customs shifted, identities merged, and eventually, the administrative labels that once defined them, tribe, clan, region, stopped being used. From a historical standpoint, this outcome was ordinary. Empires rose and fell, peoples moved, names changed. But from the perspective of memory, it was extraordinary. Because when later writers looked back and saw no clear line connecting those ancient tribes to their present, the simplest explanation was disappearance. And that assumption would echo for centuries. The Assyrian machine did not erase the 10 tribes. It absorbed them so thoroughly that they faded from view, not lost in the wilderness, but lost in plain sight, hidden by the very systems designed to control them. After the Assyrian conquest, the historical trail does not end in flames or mass graves. It ends in something far more unsettling for historians: silence. And it is this silence, more than any battle or deportation, that gave birth to the mystery of the lost tribes. Because when we look for what happened next, the problem is not conflicting accounts. The problem is that there are almost no accounts at all. Assyrian imperial records, which had been meticulous up to the point of conquest, suddenly move on. They record victories, list deported populations, and then turn their attention elsewhere. New rebellions, new territories, new kings. The former kingdom of Israel becomes just another reorganized province within a vast empire. No follow-up, no commentary on cultural survival, no concern with preserving tribal distinctions. From the Assyrian perspective, the story was finished. Biblical texts, however, treat this silence very differently. Written primarily from Judah and often generations later, they frame the fall of Israel as both a national tragedy and a theological warning. The narrative emphasizes exile, punishment, and separation. Yet even here, the text is selective. It speaks of deportation but rarely describes what happens afterward. There are no detailed accounts of where the tribes went, how they lived, or how long they remained distinct. The loss is stated, not explained. This creates a contradiction, not in facts, but in expectations. Imperial archives were never designed to track identity over generations. They cared about order, labor, and tribute. Biblical authors, on the other hand, cared deeply about identity, covenant, and continuity. When they could no longer trace the northern tribes within their own social and religious framework, absence took on meaning, and that meaning grew over time. What's striking is that silence in ancient history is normal. Countless peoples disappeared from the record without becoming legends. The Philistines, for example, fade without inspiring centuries of speculation. But Israel was different because it remained central to an ongoing religious tradition. The missing tribes became a theological problem that demanded resolution. As centuries passed, this lack of information became fertile ground. Later interpreters began asking questions the original text never tried to answer. If the tribes were exiled, where exactly did they go? If they survived, why were they never heard from again? And if they vanished completely, how did that fit with beliefs about divine promise and chosenness? In the absence of evidence, imagination stepped in. Contradictions between sources only intensified this process. Imperial records suggested absorption and continuity. Biblical narratives suggested rupture and loss. Neither side explicitly claimed mystery, but later readers, encountering gaps between the two, began to see one. The silence itself became suspicious, as if something important had been deliberately hidden. This is a crucial turning point in the story of the lost tribes, because from this moment on, the mystery no longer depended on events. It depended on interpretation. Every unanswered question invited speculation. Every missing detail encouraged expansion. By late antiquity and the medieval period, the absence of records was no longer seen as a limitation of ancient bureaucracy or historiography. It was seen as proof that the tribes must be somewhere else, proof that they must be waiting, proof that history, somehow, had missed them. But historians approach silence differently. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence or of presence. It usually reflects priorities. Empires didn't document cultural afterlives. Biblical authors didn't chronicle communities beyond their influence. And later historians inherited both blind spots. So the lost tribes were not unrecorded because they were uniquely mysterious. They were unrecorded because no one with the power to preserve their story had a reason to do so. Once their administrative and religious frameworks dissolved, their names stopped appearing, not because they vanished, but because the categories that defined them did. And yet, the human mind resists unresolved endings. Silence feels unfinished, it demands explanation. This is how absence became evidence, not in the ancient world, but in the centuries that followed. The gaps in the record transformed from historical inconvenience into narrative opportunity, and from that opportunity, a legend began to grow, one that would travel far beyond the ancient Near East, reshaped again and again by those who needed the lost tribes to mean something more than what the evidence allowed. If the disappearance of the northern tribes had truly been experienced as an unsolved geographical mystery, we would expect early Jewish thinkers to treat it as an urgent problem. We would expect expeditions, debates about routes and borders, speculation about distant lands. But that's not what we find. Instead, when rabbinic literature begins to engage with the fate of the lost tribes, it does so with remarkable restraint. The loss is acknowledged, even mourned, but it is not pursued. Early Jewish thought approached the exile of the northern tribes through a moral and theological lens, not a cartographic one. The central concern was not where the tribes went, but why the exile happened at all. In rabbinic discussions, the fall of the northern kingdom becomes an ethical lesson about idolatry, injustice, and communal responsibility. Geography fades into the background, meaning takes center stage. This focus reflects how Judaism understood history itself. Events were not merely sequences of cause and effect, they were expressions of covenantal relationships. Exile in this framework was not a logistical problem to be solved, but a spiritual condition to be confronted. The northern tribes were not lost because no one could find them. They were lost because they had lost alignment with the values that sustained communal life. Rabbinic texts do speculate occasionally about the fate of the 10 tribes, but these discussions are cautious and often symbolic. Some traditions suggest they were scattered beyond known borders. Others imply they were assimilated. A few imagine a future return, but none of these ideas become dominant doctrines, and none inspire organized efforts to locate or reclaim them. The ambiguity itself is preserved, this restraint is telling. Early Judaism was shaped by survival under foreign rule, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman. Its intellectual energy was directed inward toward law, ethics, and communal continuity. The idea of sending search parties into unknown lands to recover lost tribes simply did not align with how identity was understood. Belonging was defined by practice, not by distant ancestry. There is also a practical dimension. The rabbis recognized implicitly that after generations of dispersion and intermarriage, the concept of a pure, recoverable tribal population was unrealistic. Identity had already shifted. Communities had merged. The world had changed. To insist on recovery would have required freezing history in place, something Judaism, as a living tradition, resisted. Instead, rabbinic thought often reframed the loss in universal terms. Exile was not unique to the northern tribes. It was an ongoing condition experienced by the Jewish people as a whole. Babylonian exile, Roman exile, and later diasporas reinforced this perspective. The fate of Israel was not to be found on a map, but in how communities maintained cohesion despite displacement. This is why early Judaism did not produce elaborate legends of hidden kingdoms or warrior tribes waiting beyond the horizon. Those stories would emerge later, shaped by different cultural pressures. In rabbinic literature, the lost tribes function more as a cautionary memory than a mystery. They represent what happens when social bonds fracture and ethical obligations erode. In some traditions, the possibility of return is left deliberately open, not as a promise to be pursued, but as a hope to be held. The tribes might return in a messianic future, but only as part of a broader transformation, not through human intervention. Until then, the ambiguity remains intact. This approach stands in sharp contrast to what comes later. Medieval and early modern thinkers, especially outside Judaism, would become fascinated by the physical whereabouts of the lost tribes. Maps would be drawn, journeys imagined, entire populations reclassified. But early Jewish thought resisted that impulse. It did not need the tribes to be found in order for history to make sense. In many ways, this was a safeguard. By refusing to anchor identity to unreachable ancestors or distant lands, Judaism preserved a flexible, practice-based understanding of belonging. The lost tribes could be mourned without being mythologized, remembered without being chased, and in that choice, to let loss remain unresolved without turning it into obsession, early Jewish thought quietly prevented a mystery from becoming something far more dangerous, a justification. As Christianity emerged from within the Jewish world of the first century, it inherited not only sacred texts, but unresolved questions. Among them was the fate of the northern tribes. But unlike rabbinic Judaism, which treated that loss with restraint, early Christianity approached it with a different urgency, one shaped by eschatology. The question was no longer what had happened in the past, but what was about to happen at the end of time. From the beginning, Christian thinkers read Hebrew scriptures through a forward-looking lens. Prophecy was not confined to ancient Israel. It was seen as a roadmap pointing toward a future climax in human history. Within that framework, the lost tribes took on a new role. They were no longer administrative groups absorbed by empire. They became actors waiting off stage, destined to return at the moment of divine resolution. This shift had profound consequences. Historical inquiry gave way to theological expectation. Instead of asking how the tribes were assimilated or reorganized under Assyrian rule, Christian interpreters focused on symbolic fulfillment. Passages about gathering the exiles were read not as reflections on past trauma, but as predictions. The tribes were not gone, they were delayed. Early Christian writers speculated that the lost tribes lived beyond the boundaries of the known world, preserved by God for a future purpose. Some imagined them sealed behind natural barriers. Others suggested they would reappear during the final conversion of the nations. These ideas were rarely grounded in evidence. They didn't need to be. Their power came from narrative coherence, not historical verification. In this theological worldview, geography became flexible. Unknown lands were blank spaces waiting to be filled with meaning. The farther away a place was, the more plausible it became as a hiding place for biblical history. Distance itself became proof. This reinterpretation also solved a theological tension. Christianity defined itself as a universal faith, open to all peoples, yet it drew authority from a particular Jewish past. The lost tribes offered a bridge between those ideas. They represented Israel extended outward, scattered among the nations, waiting to be gathered into a new spiritual order. Over time, this symbolism hardened. The tribes were no longer discussed as real communities that might have blended into surrounding populations. They were transformed into signs. Their return would mark the beginning of the end. Their absence validated the present moment as incomplete. History was suspended between loss and fulfillment. What's striking is how little interest there was in verifying these claims. No serious effort was made to trace Assyrian deportation routes or analyze imperial resettlement practices. That kind of inquiry would not have served the theology. The mystery had to remain intact for the narrative to work. By the late Roman and early medieval periods, the lost tribes were firmly embedded in Christian eschatological imagination. They appeared in sermons, commentaries, and apocalyptic literature. They were invoked to explain chaos, justify mission, and frame history as a linear progression toward divine climax. This was a fundamental departure from earlier Jewish approaches. Where rabbinic thought held ambiguity, Christianity filled it with certainty. Where silence once suggested limitation, it now suggested intention. The tribes were not missing because history failed to record them. They were missing because God willed it so. And in making that shift, the lost tribes were severed from their historical roots. They were no longer Iron Age populations shaped by empire and adaptation. They became abstract placeholders in a cosmic timeline. This transformation didn't just reinterpret the past, it reshaped the future. Because once the lost tribes were imagined as waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, it became possible, inevitable even, that someone would eventually claim to have found them. When Islam emerged in the 7th century, it entered a world already saturated with stories about ancient Israel. Jewish and Christian traditions were well known across the Middle East, and the idea of the lost tribes was already circulating in theological and popular imagination. But Islamic scholarship approached this inherited material with a markedly different lens, one that would significantly limit how far the mystery could grow. The Quran speaks frequently of the children of Israel. Their prophets, trials, moral failures, and divine guidance are woven throughout the text. But what's striking is what the Quran does not do. It does not linger on the idea of disappearance. It does not describe missing tribes hidden beyond the world's edges. And it does not frame exile as an unresolved geographical puzzle. Instead, the narrative emphasis is moral and instructional. In Islamic theology, history functions as a series of lessons. People's rise, fall are scattered or restored according to ethical behavior and divine law. The fate of the children of Israel is presented as part of this broader pattern. Exile is a consequence. Survival is assumed. The focus is not on where people went, but on why events unfolded as they did. Early Muslim historians inherited biblical material but filtered it through this framework. When they encountered stories of the lost tribes, they treated them cautiously. Rather than speculating about distant lands or secret kingdoms, they emphasized continuity. The Israelites were understood to have dispersed, intermingled, and persisted within known societies. Their identity mattered morally and religiously, not as a mystery to be solved. This resistance to speculative geography is one of the most important differences between Islamic scholarship and contemporary Christian traditions. While medieval Christian writers placed the lost tribes at the edges of the world, beyond rivers, mountains, or mythic barriers, Muslim geographers and historians were deeply invested in mapping the real world accurately. They catalogued trade routes, cities, peoples, and climates with remarkable precision. A hidden nation of ancient Israelites simply did not fit into that worldview. That doesn't mean Islamic scholars denied exile or dispersion. On the contrary, they accepted it as historical reality, but they saw it as part of the normal flow of human societies under empire and conquest. Peoples move, names change, lineages blend. None of this required supernatural concealment. In some Islamic traditions, the lost tribes appear briefly in eschatological discussions, but even there they are not central figures. They are not imagined as a pure, preserved people waiting to re-emerge. Instead, they are reminders of divine justice and accountability. Their story is complete enough to teach a lesson, even if every detail is not recorded. This approach had a stabilizing effect on the narrative. By refusing to inflate silence into mystery, Islamic scholarship limited the imaginative space in which legends could grow. The absence of detailed records was accepted as a limitation of history, not an invitation to fantasy. It also reflected Islam's broader relationship to earlier scriptures. The Quran positions itself as a confirmation and correction of previous revelations, not an extension of their unresolved questions. Where ambiguity existed, it was often left intact rather than elaborated. That restraint matters, because it shows that the lost tribes were not an inevitable mystery. They became one only under certain interpretive pressures tied to end-times theology, expansionist ambition, and the desire to locate divine purpose in geography. Islamic historians, operating under different assumptions, simply did not feel compelled to ask the same questions. In their writings, the children of Israel are not missing nations scattered beyond reach. They are moral exemplars within human history, sometimes obedient, sometimes failing, always accountable. Their dispersion does not require rediscovery. Their story already serves its purpose. This perspective didn't erase the idea of the lost tribes entirely, but it kept it contained. It prevented speculation from overtaking scholarship, and in doing so, it offers a revealing contrast. Where other traditions saw silence and imagined distance, Islamic scholarship saw silence and moved on. The mystery, once again, was not in the past. It was in how later generations chose to read it. By the medieval period, the world had become both larger and smaller at the same time. Trade routes stretched across continents, pilgrims moved between holy cities, and stories travelled farther than most people ever would. Yet despite this growing connectivity, geography remained deeply fragmented. Vast regions were still unknown to most readers, and even well-travelled routes were filtered through rumour, second-hand testimony, and imagination. It was in this space, between expanding horizons and limited verification, that the lost tribes began to reappear, not as history, but as legend. Medieval Jewish and Christian travellers played a central role in this transformation. Their accounts were often sincere attempts to document the world as they encountered it, but they were also shaped by expectation. Travellers did not merely observe, they interpreted. And when ancient texts suggested that the lost tribes existed somewhere beyond the known world, every unfamiliar land became a potential confirmation. One of the most influential figures in this tradition was Benjamin of Tudela, a 12th century Jewish traveller whose journey took him across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and into parts of Central Asia. His travelogue blended careful observation with inherited tradition. He described Jewish communities living far from Europe, some prosperous, some isolated. But as his account moved farther from familiar regions, the tone changed. He relayed stories of powerful Jewish tribes living beyond impassable rivers, maintaining independence, practicing ancient customs, and waiting for redemption. These were not eyewitness reports in the modern sense. They were compilations, stories gathered from local informants, traders, and fellow travelers, filtered through centuries of expectation. But to medieval readers, the distinction mattered little. The further away a place was, the harder it was to challenge. Distance protected the story. Christian travelers and writers adopted similar themes, often with even greater embellishment. Rivers of fire that could only be crossed on the Sabbath. Mountains so steep they isolated entire nations. Warrior tribes descended from ancient Israel, undefeated and waiting for a divine signal. These elements repeated across texts not because they were independently verified, but because they resonated with existing beliefs. This is how medieval world building worked. Maps were not just representations of space, they were expressions of meaning. Unknown regions were filled with wonders, monsters, and moral narratives. The lost tribes fit perfectly into this structure. They occupied the edges of the world where certainty faded and imagination took over. What's important is that these legends were not created out of thin air. They drew from earlier theological interpretations, especially Christian eschatology, which expected the tribes to reappear in the end times. Medieval travel literature gave those expectations a physical form. The tribes were no longer abstract future symbols, they were placed somewhere specific, even if no one could point to them precisely. Limited geographic knowledge played a critical role here. Without accurate maps or standardized verification, repetition became validation. If multiple sources mentioned a hidden Jewish kingdom beyond a great river, it felt confirmed, even if all those sources ultimately traced back to the same tradition. Certainty was constructed through accumulation, not evidence. For Jewish readers, these stories carried hope. They suggested that exile was not total, that somewhere Jewish autonomy had survived untouched. For Christian readers, they reinforced apocalyptic narratives. The tribes were preserved by God, waiting to fulfill prophecy. In both cases, the lost tribes became emotionally useful. But usefulness comes at a cost. As these legends solidified, they began to detach completely from historical reality. The Assyrian deportations, the gradual assimilation, the collapse of administrative systems, none of that mattered anymore. The medieval imagination preferred clean separation over messy continuity. And so, the lost tribes became medieval creations as much as ancient ones. They were shaped by the limits of knowledge, the hunger for meaning, and the human tendency to turn uncertainty into story. Once placed on the map, no matter how vaguely, they were no longer just missing. They were waiting. And waiting, as history would soon demonstrate, is an invitation to be found. What happened next is the stuff of legend, not because new evidence appeared, but because the story itself learned how to travel. By the late medieval period, the lost tribes were no longer confined to theology or scholarly speculation. They escaped into a wider cultural space where belief, entertainment, and ambition blurred. Once that happened, the legend became something far more powerful than history. It became portable. Adventure literature played a decisive role in this transformation. Tales of distant lands, miraculous encounters, and hidden kingdoms circulated widely, reaching audiences who would never read theological treatises or imperial records. In these stories, the lost tribes were no longer abstract symbols or moral lessons. They were characters. They ruled remote territories, defended their borders, and preserved ancient laws in isolation from a corrupt world. Each retelling expanded the myth. Details changed depending on the audience, but the core elements remained consistent: separation, purity, and anticipation. The tribes were imagined as untouched by history, waiting beyond the reach of time itself. That image was intoxicating. It promised continuity in a world defined by disruption. The portability of the myth was its greatest strength. It could be placed anywhere unknown, beyond Central Asia, deep in Africa, across vast oceans. Wherever maps ended, the lost tribes could begin. No single location needed to be proven, because the story thrived on possibility rather than confirmation. This adaptability made the legend expandable. New elements could be added without contradiction, Rivers of fire became mountain ranges. Hidden valleys turned into island kingdoms. Warrior tribes took on new enemies, new alliances, new roles in the unfolding drama of salvation history. The lost tribes were no longer constrained by ancient texts. They were limited only by imagination. Importantly, this expansion didn't feel dishonest to its audiences. Medieval readers did not separate myth and history the way modern historians do. Stories were valued for what they revealed about meaning, destiny, and order. A legend that explained the world was often more persuasive than a record that merely described it. As Europe edged closer to the early modern period, this mythic framework began to align with something else entirely: expansion. Exploration was accelerating. New routes were being charted. Lands previously marked as unknown were becoming accessible, and with that shift came an extraordinary opportunity. If the lost tribes existed somewhere beyond the horizon, then discovery was not just exploration, it was recovery. This is the moment when legend becomes actionable. The lost tribes were now imagined not only as survivors but as potential allies, converts, or subjects. They could validate expansion as destiny. If explorers encountered unfamiliar peoples, the myth offered an explanation ready-made. Difference could be reframed as ancient kinship. Conquest could be softened into reunion. The legend also carried a moral hierarchy. The lost tribes were presumed noble, disciplined, and divinely preserved. Any population identified with them inherited those qualities, at least in theory. But that identification was rarely neutral. It was imposed, interpreted, and often weaponized. By the time European powers began crossing oceans in earnest, the lost tribes were no longer waiting quietly in manuscripts. They were embedded in the cultural imagination. They shaped expectations before ships ever set sail. They influenced how new worlds would be seen and how their people would be classified. This is why the story accelerates here. The legend had matured. It was flexible enough to survive contradiction and broad enough to apply anywhere. Most importantly, it was useful. The lost tribes were no longer a question about the past. They were a tool for the future. And once a myth becomes useful, it rarely remains harmless. When European explorers began crossing oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, they did not arrive with empty minds. They carried maps filled with scripture, legends shaped by medieval imagination, and expectations inherited from centuries of speculation. Among those expectations was the belief that the lost tribes of Israel were still out there, somewhere. And as new lands came into view, the question was no longer whether the tribes existed, but whether they had just been found. Almost immediately, explorers and missionaries began to recognize the lost tribes wherever they went. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were described as descendants of ancient Israelites, their customs filtered through biblical parallels. In Africa, Asian highlands and remote islands, unfamiliar rituals and social structures were interpreted not on their own terms, but as echoes of scripture. Difference became confirmation. This recognition was not accidental. It served a purpose. If newly encountered peoples were part of a biblical narrative, then European expansion could be framed as reunion rather than invasion. Conquest could be softened into recovery. Conversion could be justified as restoration. The myth did not merely explain the world, it reordered it morally. Biblical validation became a powerful tool. Explorers wrote letters and reports emphasizing similarities between local customs and Old Testament practices, often ignoring contradictions. Dietary habits, clothing, circumcision, or ritual cleanliness were highlighted as proof, even when these practices were common across many unrelated cultures. Selective observation turned coincidence into certainty. The lost tribes myth also solved a theological problem. How could Christianity claim universal authority while expanding into lands never mentioned in Scripture? By identifying new populations as ancient Israelites, explorers retroactively inserted them into sacred history. The world suddenly made sense again, but this was projection, not discovery. These claims rarely emerged from the communities themselves. Identity was assigned, not recognized. Indigenous histories were overwritten with biblical genealogy, often erasing complex local traditions in the process. Once labeled as lost tribes, entire peoples could be reclassified within European frameworks of hierarchy and destiny. This had real consequences. Communities identified as Israelites were treated differently, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with suspicion, often with control. The myth justified missionary pressure, colonial administration, and, in some cases, forced cultural transformation. To resist was to reject not just empire, but divine history. The adaptability of the lost tribes legend made it especially dangerous. It could be applied selectively. If a group fit European expectations, the myth elevated them. If not, it could be withdrawn. Identity became conditional. By the 17th century, the lost tribes were no longer a distant curiosity. They were an active part of colonial logic. Maps, travelogues, and sermons reinforced the idea that European expansion was uncovering ancient truths rather than imposing new realities. This period marks a turning point. The myth crossed a line, from narrative into policy, from speculation into justification. What had once been a response to historical silence now filled that silence with authority. The age of exploration did not uncover the lost tribes. It needed them. Because in a world being rapidly claimed and controlled, the past offered legitimacy, and the lost tribes, endlessly malleable and conveniently absent from records, provided exactly that. By the time European empires reached their height, the search for the lost tribes had been stripped of uncertainty and recast as scholarship. What had once been speculation was now presented as research. Travelogues became ethnographies, sermons turned into theories, and entire academic frameworks emerged to classify newly encountered peoples according to biblical ancestry, often without their consent and almost always without their input. Indigenous communities across Africa, the Americas, and Asia were increasingly described as Israelites, not because they identified that way, but because European observers needed them to fit a familiar story. Physical features were scrutinized, customs were dissected, languages were distorted through translation. Any resemblance, real or imagined, was elevated to proof, while contradictions were dismissed as corruption or degeneration. This was not neutral curiosity, it was imperial logic at work. Colonial powers were obsessed with order. To govern vast territories and diverse populations, they needed systems of classification. Race theory, emerging alongside colonial expansion, offered a pseudo-scientific hierarchy. Biblical genealogy provided a sacred one. Together they formed a powerful narrative. Humanity divided into families, some closer to divine favor than others. Within this framework, labeling indigenous peoples as lost Israelites was paradoxically both elevating and controlling. On one hand, it granted them a prestigious origin. On the other, it stripped them of agency. Their identities were no longer their own histories, but chapters in someone else's scripture. Scholars and missionaries produced elaborate charts tracing indigenous lineages back to ancient Israel. These genealogies ignored archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and historical continuity in favor of textual resemblance. If a people practiced circumcision, they must be Israelites. If they followed dietary rules, Israelites. If they didn't, that too could be explained through exile, corruption, or distance from the original law. The logic was circular and unfalsifiable. Race theory reinforced this process. Physical appearance was interpreted through biblical lenses. Skin color, hair texture, and facial features were all assigned moral and historical meaning. Some groups were imagined as pure descendants of the lost tribes, others as degraded remnants. Either way, their humanity was reduced to ancestry. What's telling is how little these theories changed based on evidence. They shifted instead based on political need. If a population resisted colonial rule, their supposed Israelite origin could be revoked. If cooperation was useful, it could be emphasized. Identity became a tool, adjustable at will. This so-called scholarship reveals far more about colonizers than the colonized. It exposes an obsession with legitimacy. Empire needed a moral story to justify domination. By framing conquest as rediscovery, colonizers could cast themselves as agents of history rather than its disruptors. The Lost Tribes myth was perfect for this purpose. It explained difference without challenging authority. It allowed Europeans to claim knowledge of other people's pasts while ignoring their present realities. It transformed living cultures into relics waiting to be interpreted, and crucially, it erased indigenous voices. Rarely were these communities asked how they understood themselves. Their histories were overwritten, their identities reassigned. The myth spoke over them. By the 19th century, these ideas had hardened into academic convention. Museums labelled artifacts as Israelite. Textbooks repeated genealogical claims. The colonial fantasy had achieved institutional credibility. But beneath the veneer of scholarship was a simple truth. These claims were not discoveries. They were projections. They did not arise from evidence, but from expectation. They were less about finding the lost tribes than about finding reassurance, proof that empire, conquest, and hierarchy were part of a divine plan. The lost tribes, once again, were not found. They were invented, this time in the language of science and scripture combined, and the cost of that invention was real. By the 19th century, the myth of the lost tribes no longer needed distant continents or unfamiliar peoples to sustain itself. It turned inward. Instead of projecting ancient Israel onto colonized populations, a new movement made a far bolder claim. The lost tribes had not been found abroad at all. They had been at home the entire time, in Britain. This idea, known as British Israelism, argued that the Anglo-Saxon peoples, particularly the British, were the direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. According to its proponents, the tribes deported by Assyria had migrated westward over centuries, eventually settling in the British Isles. The theory was elaborate, confident, and almost entirely disconnected from historical evidence. And yet, it spread widely. British Israelism emerged at a moment when empire required moral certainty. Britain was not just a global power, it was the global power. Its navy dominated the seas. Its colonies spanned continents. Its political influence reshaped the world. The question was no longer whether Britain ruled, but why it deserved to. The lost tribes provided an answer. Advocates of British Israelism combed the Bible for linguistic coincidences, symbolic parallels, and selective prophecies. Hebrew names were reinterpreted to resemble English place names. Royal genealogies were traced back to King David through speculative leaps. The British monarchy itself was cast as the continuation of biblical kingship, fulfilling divine promise. This was not fringe thinking. British Israelism found followers among clergy, politicians, and intellectuals. Pamphlets circulated, sermons preached destiny. The idea that Britain was a chosen nation, literally Israel reborn, offered powerful reassurance in an age of expansion and anxiety. What made British Israelism particularly effective was its inward focus. Unlike colonial projections imposed on others, this myth validated the colonizer directly. It transformed empire from an economic and military project into a sacred mission. Britain did not conquer because it was powerful. It was powerful because it was chosen. Religion was reshaped accordingly. Biblical narratives were reread to center Britain. Prophecies once tied to ancient Israel were mapped onto modern geopolitics. Success became proof of divine favor. Failure, when it occurred, was framed as temporary testing. This fusion of myth and nationalism had consequences. It blurred the line between faith and identity. To be British was not just to belong to a nation, it was to inherit a sacred role in history. Other peoples, by extension, were placed outside that chosenness, or beneath it. The Lost Tribes myth was no longer about recovery or reunion, it was about entitlement. What's revealing is how selectively history was used. Assyrian records were ignored, archaeology was dismissed, genetic continuity was assumed rather than demonstrated. British Israelism did not survive because it explained the past well, it survived because it explained the present conveniently, and it reshaped Christianity in the process. Universalist theology gave way to national exceptionalism. Moral responsibility became secondary to destiny. Empire was no longer something to question, it was something to fulfill. This way of thinking would not remain confined to Britain. Variations appeared elsewhere, influencing nationalist movements that linked divine favor to ethnicity and power. The Lost Tribes became a template for self-mythologizing, adaptable to different political needs. British Israelism eventually declined as academic standards tightened and the horrors of nationalist theology became impossible to ignore. But its influence lingered. It demonstrated how easily myth could be repurposed, how a story born from silence could be transformed into a declaration of supremacy. In this form, the lost tribes were no longer missing. They were claimed, and in being claimed, they revealed something uncomfortable. The myth had always been less about history and more about who gets to write it. By the 20th century, the myth of the lost tribes collided with something it had rarely confronted before: living communities who claimed Israelite identity on their own terms. Unlike colonial projections or nationalist fantasies, these claims did not originate in European scholarship or imperial theology. They emerged from oral history, ritual practice, and collective memory passed down over generations. And they forced a difficult question into the open: who gets to decide what counts as belonging? One of the most well-known examples is Beta Israel, the Jewish community of Ethiopia. For centuries they maintained distinct religious traditions, sacred texts, dietary laws, and communal structures that closely resembled early forms of Judaism. They did so in near isolation, without rabbinic institutions or contact with global Jewish centers. To outsiders, they were a mystery. To themselves, they were simply Jews, yet recognition did not come easily. When Beta Israel sought formal acceptance in the modern era, they were subjected to scrutiny that revealed deep discomfort within external authorities. Their practices were compared to rabbinic norms that developed long after their separation. Their history was questioned because it did not align neatly with written records. Identity became conditional, something to be verified, not lived. The Lemba people of southern Africa present a different but equally complex case. Their oral traditions describe descent from ancient Israelites who migrated southward long ago. They practice male circumcision, follow dietary restrictions resembling kosher laws, and maintain clan-based religious roles. For centuries, these traditions were preserved internally, without any expectation of recognition. When genetic studies in the late 20th century suggested Middle Eastern ancestry in some Lemba lineages, particularly among priestly clans, external interests surged. Headlines declared scientific proof, but the reaction exposed a troubling pattern. Suddenly, identity that had been questioned for generations was validated only when confirmed by DNA. Culture alone had not been enough. The Beni Manash of northeastern India illustrate the same tension in another form. Their traditions recount descent from the tribe of Manasseh, one of the lost tribes. For decades, their claims were dismissed as myth or recent invention, yet their community maintained rituals, prayers, and identity markers that aligned with ancient Israelite tradition, even after centuries of separation. In each case, recognition came slowly, and often with conditions. Communities were asked to undergo formal conversion, adapt their practices, or submit to external authority in order to be accepted. The burden of proof rested entirely on them. This is where the danger lies. Demanding proof of identity assumes that identity is static, measurable, and externally verifiable. But history shows the opposite. Jewish identity itself has never been uniform. It has evolved across time, geography, and circumstance. Practices differ, languages shift, texts change. To demand that marginalized communities conform to a single standard is to misunderstand how traditions survive. There is also an asymmetry of power. Communities like Beta Israel, the Lemba, and the Beni Manash were not inventing identity for gain. In many cases, their claims brought hardship, scrutiny, and upheaval. Yet their legitimacy was judged through frameworks shaped by centuries of exclusion, colonial classification, and racial bias. External validation, whether through religious authorities or genetic testing, can offer recognition, but it also risks reducing identity to compliance. DNA does not carry culture, oral history does not require permission, and belonging cannot be reverse engineered from a lab result. These cases expose the final irony of the lost tribes narrative. After centuries of speculation, projection, and fantasy, when communities finally stepped forward and said, "We are here," the response was hesitation. The myth had been easier than the reality. The lost tribes, it turned out, were never just a historical question. They were a test of how identity is recognized, who controls the narrative, and whether living tradition is allowed to define itself. And that test is still ongoing. By the late 20th century, a new authority entered the debate over the lost tribes: genetics. Where texts were ambiguous and oral histories contested, DNA promised clarity, a biological record written into the body itself. For many, it seemed like the final arbiter, an objective answer to a question that had been shaped for centuries by myth, theology, and politics. But science, as it turned out, complicated the story rather than resolving it. Genetic studies of Jewish populations have revealed patterns of shared ancestry across wide geographic distances. Many Jewish communities, particularly those with long-established traditions, show genetic links to the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. These findings support historical models of dispersion rather than disappearance. They suggest continuity through movement, intermarriage, and adaptation, not isolation. When applied to communities associated with the lost tribes, however, genetic data has often been misunderstood. In some cases, such as the Lemba, certain lineages show markers associated with Middle Eastern ancestry. In others, like the Bene Menashe, genetic evidence is mixed or inconclusive. And in communities such as Beta Israel, genetic profiles reflect long-term residence in Africa alongside religious continuity. None of this is surprising to geneticists. Human populations are dynamic, genes flow, lineages overlap. After thousands of years, expecting a clear biological signature of an Iron Age tribe is unrealistic. Genetics can suggest historical connections, but it cannot reconstruct identity. This is where confusion sets in. Popular narratives often treat DNA as a yes or no test of belonging. Either you are or you aren't. But modern scholars reject this framing. Ancestry, culture, and identity operate on different planes. Genetic similarity does not create shared tradition. Cultural practice does not require genetic purity. And belonging cannot be reduced to percentages. History reinforces this distinction. Jewish identity has always been shaped by conversion, adoption, and community affiliation. From antiquity onward, individuals and groups joined Jewish communities without shared ancestry. At the same time, many people with Jewish ancestry left the tradition entirely. DNA records movement, not meaning. Scholars also warn against the political misuse of genetic research. When DNA becomes a gatekeeper, it risks reviving older hierarchies under a scientific banner. Who gets tested? Who sets the thresholds? Who decides which markers matter? These questions echo the same power dynamics that shaped colonial classifications. As a result, modern academic consensus is cautious. Genetics is treated as one tool among many, not as a final authority. Archaeology, linguistics, textual analysis, and anthropology all contribute pieces of the puzzle. None alone can define identity. This caution is deliberate. The history of the lost tribes demonstrates how easily uncertainty can be exploited. Scholars today are acutely aware that scientific findings do not exist in a vacuum. They enter cultural conversations already shaped by longing, exclusion, and myth. In that sense, DNA has not answered the ancient question, it has reframed it. Instead of asking whether the lost tribes survived biologically, scholars ask how identities persist socially. Instead of searching for purity, they examine continuity. Instead of certainty, they accept complexity. The limits of proof are not failures of science. They are reminders of what science is and is not designed to do. DNA can tell us about migration, mixing, and shared ancestry. It cannot tell us who belongs, what stories matter, or how communities understand themselves. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. After centuries of searching for the lost tribes in maps, myths, and molecules, the evidence points in an unexpected direction. Identity was never hidden in the blood. It lived and still lives in practice, memory, and choice. After centuries of searching, speculating, mapping, and myth-making, the question that remains is deceptively simple. Were the lost tribes ever truly lost at all? Or is lost the wrong word entirely? One that reveals more about how history is remembered than about what actually happened. When historians strip away theology, colonial fantasy, and nationalist projection, a quieter explanation emerges. The northern tribes of ancient Israel were not annihilated. They were not hidden behind mythic rivers or sealed off beyond the edges of the world. They were absorbed, and absorption, unlike destruction, leaves few dramatic traces. Assimilation is one of the most common outcomes in human history. Empires conquer, populations move, names change, customs adapt. Over generations, distinct identities blur into broader societies. This process does not feel like disappearance to those living through it. It feels like survival. The Assyrian deportations dismantled political and administrative structures, not genetic existence. Tribal identities, which had already been flexible and regionally defined, lost their function once the system that sustained them collapsed. People married, worked, worshipped, and raised children within new imperial contexts. Over time, the labels that once defined them stopped being used. Not because the people were gone, but because the categories no longer mattered. From a historical perspective, this outcome is unremarkable. Countless ancient groups followed the same path. The difference is that Israel's story continued to be told, by others, from elsewhere, and for different reasons. Judah survived, its texts endured, and from that vantage point, the absence of the northern tribes became visible as loss. But absence is relative. A people can vanish from one narrative while continuing in another. This is how populations disappear without vanishing. They leave behind fewer monuments. Their names fade, their stories merge into larger ones. Yet biologically and culturally, they persist in fragments, customs, genetic threads, local traditions absorbed into new identities. So why did the myth of the lost tribes outlive the people themselves? Because the myth served needs that history could not. It offered closure where none existed. It transformed administrative collapse into moral drama. It turned silence into expectation. And most importantly, it remained adaptable. The lost tribes could mean different things at different times. For rabbis, they were a warning. For Christians, a future sign. For medieval travelers, a hidden wonder. For empires, a justification. For modern seekers, a source of identity. The people themselves were secondary. The idea was what endured. This adaptability gave the myth extraordinary longevity. It survived evidence, contradicted records, and absorbed new interpretations without breaking. Few historical narratives are so flexible. There is also a psychological dimension. Humans struggle with incomplete endings. We want recovery stories. We prefer return over dissolution. The idea that entire identities can slowly dissolve into history is unsettling. The lost tribes offered an alternative. Somewhere, they still exist. But history rarely provides such neat resolutions. It is messy, continuous, and indifferent to symbolic closure. Populations change without ceremony. Names disappear while people remain. In this sense, the lost tribes were not a mystery to be solved, but a misunderstanding to be examined. They were not hidden from the world. They were absorbed into it. The real legacy of the lost tribes is not found in distant lands or genetic markers. It lies in how societies respond to loss, how absence becomes story, how story becomes belief, and how belief can shape centuries of thought and action. The tribes were not lost in the wilderness. They were lost in memory, and memory, as this story has shown, can be far more powerful than fact. After following the lost tribes across empires, scriptures, maps, myths, and laboratories, we arrive at a final realization that quietly reframes everything that came before. The true mystery was never where the lost tribes went. It was why so many people, across so many centuries, needed them to be somewhere at all. The lost tribes functioned as a mirror. Each era that encountered their silence reflected its own anxieties, ambitions, and assumptions into that empty space. When records failed, belief stepped in. When belief grew uncertain, myth provided structure. And when power needed justification, the myth adapted. For ancient Judah, the loss explained trauma. For early Jewish thought, it became a moral lesson, one that warned against social fracture and ethical collapse. For Christianity, the tribes transformed into future actors in a cosmic drama, suspended in time to validate an unfolding theology. For medieval travelers, they became proof that the world still held wonders beyond reach. And for empires, they offered something even more dangerous: legitimacy. Throughout this journey, the lost tribes were rarely allowed to be ordinary people shaped by historical forces. Ordinary stories, assimilation, adaptation, survival, were never enough. What endured instead was the idea of preservation without change, purity without history, identity frozen in time. That fantasy was comforting. It promised continuity in a world defined by upheaval. But history does not work that way. Certainty fails us more often than we admit. Records break off, names vanish, identities blur. And when that happens, myths thrive. Not because they are true, but because they are useful. They offer answers when evidence cannot. They provide meaning where the archive falls silent. The lost tribes thrived in that silence. Every unanswered question became an opening. Every gap invited projection. And over time, the myth accumulated so much cultural weight that it felt more solid than the evidence ever could. What makes this story especially revealing is how often the myth was imposed rather than discovered. Indigenous peoples were labelled Israelites without consent. Communities were asked to prove identities they had lived for generations. Nations claimed chosenness by rewriting scripture around themselves. Again and again, the lost tribes were used to explain others, or elevate the self. In the end, the tribes were never truly the subject. They were the surface. Beneath them lay deeper questions about belonging, power, and who gets to define history. Who counts as legitimate? Who decides identity? Whose silence matters, and whose doesn't? These questions did not disappear with the ancient world. They persist today, reshaped by new tools and new language, but driven by the same impulses. DNA tests promise clarity. National myths offer comfort. Simplified stories compete with complex truths. And yet, the lesson of the lost tribes points in the opposite direction. Identity is not a relic waiting to be rediscovered. It is something lived, negotiated, and carried forward, often without documentation, often without recognition. History is not a puzzle with a single hidden solution. It is a record of human adaptation, unevenly preserved and unevenly remembered. Perhaps that is the real resolution of this mystery. The lost tribes were never meant to be found. They were meant to teach us how easily absence becomes belief, and how belief, left unchecked, can reshape the world. When certainty fails, we do not simply stop asking questions, we tell stories. And those stories, if we are not careful, begin to answer for us. So the next time you encounter a historical mystery wrapped in confidence, it's worth asking, what problem is this story solving? What fear is it soothing? What power does it protect? Because sometimes the most revealing discoveries are not about the past, but about the present that keeps rewriting it. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed questioning history instead of just repeating it, check out the other videos on the channel, like and subscribe, and share this with someone who loves unraveling historical mysteries.